turn to part 3 of globalization, and we're going to focus this time on coordination. The earlier parts focused on free markets, assuming markets were free, there was no strategic behavior, everyone was able to respond to supply and demand around the globe, markets were functioning. And what we want to look at now is a slightly different way to think about globalization, more as a strategic game in the sense of I can affect what you do by my choices, you can affect what I do by your choices, and is there some kind of equilibrium that exists? You've seen these games if you've taken economics before or other social science classes in which you got, prisoner's dilemma or a social trap or tragedy of the commons in which there's a race to the bottom perhaps, or maybe there might be multiple equilibria. So again, this is going to be a look at coordination and a look at game theory to understand how we think about these problems. Not just economists, but policymakers in general, because a lot of times for policymakers, these are more games of strategy than they are just free markets running their operations. Okay, so global governance without a global government. Well, what does that mean? It means if we take away those institutions like the World Bank and the IMF and the World Trade Organization, how do we get countries to coordinate their actions around the globe if there's not a global government? Well, this means we need collective action. And what we're talking about in terms of game theory is what's called a coordination game. A coordination game means there are multiple equilibria or multiple points in which countries can agree on and have no unilateral incentive to move. Some of these points are better than others. Okay, so if we're trying to get rid of these or trying to focus in on how to coordinate around 8 billion plus people on the planet, or almost 200 countries around the planet, we're talking about treaties, we're talking about international negotiations, we're talking about trying to coordinate all our actions so we move in the same direction. Well, clearly coordination failures are not a surprise given different countries have different agendas. All right, so what's a coordination game? So we need to think a little bit about what is game theory, because game theory is the tool used to understand strategic behavior. So you can take a look at this game theory in 1 minute to get a brief, quick overview, this link to YouTube, but let's go through what we're talking about here. So game theory is really the science of strategy, and it's long been a mathematical tool, but you can understand it in more basic terms by looking at what we call normal form games or 2x2 games or 3x3 games, in which we understand best responses and we understand best responses to best responses, and we understand credible threats and incredible threats, and we understand reasonable and unreasonable beliefs. Okay, so games range from raising your kids to tennis to takeovers to mergers to presidential debates, etc., to economics, and especially something in globalization, which would be this use of tariffs again. Right? So if I use a tariff against you, you might use a tariff against me. If I put a tariff on steel that I'm importing from you, you might put a tariff on agriculture products you're importing from me. And so there's this sort of tit for tat race to the bottom in which, I get a sharp stick, you get a knife, I get a gun, you get a bazooka, and it starts to escalate until we end up in a worse spot if we had never started this fight. And the key element is interdependence. Our payoffs are linked together. When we looked at the free market, we were looking at trade, and our payoffs were both win-win. but we were not necessarily influencing each other the same way. We were trading and we were both winning, but our payoffs were linked, but they weren't interdependent in the sense that we're being we're able to capture the idea of strategic behavior with a market equilibrium. So, all right, we're going to have a quick introduction here to game theory. We'll look at a market situation or between two players, could be firms, could be countries. All right, and we're going to look at it with you can make one of two decisions. I mean, this can be expanded out to an infinite number of decisions, but let's just stick to two to make it easy. So this is John Nash, and he really truly was a mathematical genius. And if you've seen the movie A Beautiful Mind, you've seen his life story. Nash was just a brilliant young mathematician who said Adam Smith in economics in general was wrong in the sense that the invisible hand didn't work. Because, right, the invisible hand in economics means everyone moving at their own self-interest creates win-win and creates a better world for everyone. Well, what Nash said is that, well, what if there's strategic behavior between the two? What if my payoffs affect your payoffs and we're interlinked in a way so that if you choose to go high and I choose to go low, I'm going to lose and you're going to win. So now I'm going to choose to go low and you're going to stick with going low. And so we end up in an equilibrium. And in this case, we're both yelling at each other if we choose to go low in this argument and fight dirty. Whereas if we had both gone high, we would still be arguing, but there wouldn't be the personal animosity that would go with name calling, etc. His solution concept is called the Nash Equilibrium. And what that means is the threats you're making to me are credible. The best response that I have to your best response, neither of us have a unilateral incentive to change. So neither one of us are going to change when we both make these choices. That sounds a little abstract now, but I'll explain in a second. All right. Nash won the Nobel Prize even though he had suffered from schizophrenia, and they debated a long time in Stockholm whether they should give the Nobel Prize to him. But, I mean, he's got this entire concept named after him called the Nash Equilibria that is so well known and so popular, people don't even bother to know who Nash was anymore. They just call it a Nash Equilibrium. But this is him. So there are three elements in every game: the players, the strategies available to each player, and payoffs. So if you thought about it like a sporting event, you got two teams, and the strategies are like a playbook, and the payoffs are what emerge if I use play 1 and you use defense 2. There's some expected payoff associated with me throwing a pass when you're expecting a run, or me running when you're expecting a run. Those payoffs are very different. Okay, so this is a payoff matrix. So there's two people here. Person 1 can do action A or B, person 2 C or D. The payoffs are in each cell. So person 1's payoffs are the payoffs on the left. So you can see 10, 12, 8, 10. Person 2's payoffs are the payoffs on the right, 2, 3, 4, 1. And so the question is, what is the equilibrium of this game? What is the stable equilibrium that we can expect in this game? So what do we think both players are going to do? So how do we interpret this box? Well, we just explained it. So example, in this case, if person 1 picks A, person 2 picks D, person 1 gets 8, person 2 gets 3 for their payoffs. Now, if we analyze this box, we can see that the social optimum is where when we add up the two numbers, we achieve the highest value, which would be action B and action C, because that's 16 which is larger than any of the other values in any other cell. So from an economic standpoint, social optimum in terms of maximizing efficiency, the size of the economic pie would be action B and action C. But is that the outcome we're likely to see? Well, let's find out. All right, so let's go back to a core principle, equilibrium. And the type we're looking for, again, is this Nash equilibrium. Any combination of strategies in which each player's strategy is his or her best choice given the other player's choices. Nobody has a unilateral reason to change his or her choice once we find that equilibrium. Now, how do you find it? So you pretend you are one of the players. Assume your opponent picks a strategy. What's your best strategy? The one that maximizes your payoff, given what your opponent does. And you repeat that for all the strategies of your opponent. Then you reverse roles, right? Now you say, suppose I'm the opponent. What do I expect the other person to do? And so you work through both the opponent's best response to your actions and you work through your best response to your opponent's actions. So it's like you have the other player's playbook and you figure out, okay, here's their offensive plays, here's the defense I'm going to use for each play. They have your playbook where they see all your plays and they figured all the defenses they would use for your plays. Now, this is a game of complete information, so everyone has everyone's playbook and there's no hidden information in this. We can do hidden information, but that's a much more complicated game we'll not look at right now. So, all right, steps 1 and 2. Assume you're person 1. Given that person 2 chooses action C, what is your best choice? Well, looking at this, clearly 12 is more than 10, so you'd pick action B. Okay, so 12 is greater than 10, so you want to underline 12. That would be your action. If player 2 picks C, you'd pick B, right? So now we know. What if player 2 picked D? Well, looking at it again, now we see 10 is greater than 8, so your best action is again to pick B because 10 is greater than 8. Okay, so looking at this, we know whatever player 2 does, your dominant strategy is just to pick action B. So now let's flip this on its head and say, well, what should player 2 do if person 1 picks A? Well, looking at this, they should pick action D because 3 is greater than 2. And if we pick action B, we should player 2 should pick action C because 4 is greater than 1. All right, so in this case, we're pretty fortunate in that the Nash equilibrium in this game is also the social optimum. See, the cell where both values are underlined is my best response to your best response, or your best response to my best response, and they're the same. We've got no unilateral incentive to deviate from the cell down in the southwest corner, 12 and 4. It's also the social optimum. Typically, that's not the way these games work, that we end up having the equilibrium being the social optimum. Oftentimes, the incentives are such that the thing unravels, and we'll look at one of those games as well. All right, double check the Nash equilibrium. What if person 1 deviated from the Nash? Person 1 would pick A instead of B. Well, they'd get 10, so there's no reason to change. Person 2, if they change from C to D, they'd go from 4 to 1. Again, there's no unilateral incentive to change. The Nash equilibrium in this game is 12 and 4. All right, that's the dominant strategy for player 1 is to pick B. Player 2, it depends on what they think player 1 is going to do. If player 2 knows player 1 is always going to pick action B, then they should always pick action C. That's going to maximize their payoffs. All right, here's a new example. In this example, you can do it on your own. Try to figure out where the Nash equilibria are. There could be 1, there could be 2, there could be 3. but typically there's either 1 or 2 in a 2 by 2 game. So go ahead and go through those 6 steps, see if you can figure it out. What you're going to find is that in this case, 2 Nash equilibria are possible, and this now is what's called a coordination game. Okay, if you're not finding this, send me an email. We can walk through the steps together. If you are finding it, great. So in this case, we got yes or no, and we can see that 2 Nash equilibria where we both disagree, 10 and 10, that's a social benefit of 20, versus we both say yes, and now the social optimum is 40. That's the highest payoff total to society. So we want to be at the equilibrium of yes, yes, and not no, no, because everybody's better off. But if we're stuck into a negative argument game, we might both be stuck at no, even though we know we both want to be at yes. Ever get in one of those arguments where nobody will back down? Well, this would be you being stuck at the 10-10 equilibrium. And you know, if one of you just backs down, you maybe get to yes, yes, but then again, maybe the other person just piles on because you look weak. And so how do you coordinate your actions so that simultaneously you both say yes? You've got to essentially jump from the no-no equilibrium to the yes-yes equilibrium. And that's what international negotiations are all about. Mistrust between countries, mistrust between the US and China, mistrust between China and Russia, mistrust between France and Germany, right? If we get stuck in a no-no, then we're stuck in a situation where what we need to do is to be able to jump to this yes, yes problem. And if we can jump to the yes, yes problem, then we're at a better equilibrium. It's a greater social payoff, right? So the 2 Nash equilibrium that are possible, and economic theory really tells us very little about which outcome is going to occur with certainty. Right? I mean, we need more information to determine what happens, because ideally, if I knew you were going to say yes, I would say yes. But if I think you're going to say no, I don't get a benefit from saying yes when you say no. I end up worse off. So then I'm going to say no. So how do we handle that? All right, so we'll come back to that coordination game in a bit. So let's now take a look at another example of a game, cooperation or defect, which is a lot of how we look at international policy. You can think of cooperating on treaties, cooperating on nuclear defense, cooperating on warfare, cooperating on trade, cooperating on civil rights. Again, we got in this game here, we have 2 prisoners. This is the prisoner's dilemma. You would think they would both cooperate, and the reward for mutual cooperation is 3 and 3, and that's 6, and that's the highest payoff. That's a socially optimal solution, that we both cooperate. But if player 1 defects, they get 5, and player 2 gets 0, so player 1 is tempted to defect. Likewise, if player 2 defects and player 1 cooperates, 2 gets 5 as their reward. And so they have incentive to defect. And so what happens then is they end up both defecting, and they both end up with the lowest reward possible, which is 1 and 1 or 2 for total. So why is that the Nash equilibrium, where they both defect? Because, well, if you defect and I want to cooperate, my payoff goes, and I'm player 1, my payoff goes from 1 to 0. Why would I cooperate if you defected? Likewise, if I'm player 2, if I cooperate when player 1 defects, I go from 1 to 0. Why would I ever change? So in this game, the cell in the southeast corner, defect is the Nash equilibrium. You can walk through those 6 steps and see that. Right? So they're being the Nash equilibrium right there. Coordination game, again, we've got 2 equilibria, 2 Nash equilibria. pub and the pub, coffee house and coffee house. If we're at the pub, there's no reason to change because we both get 0. At the coffee house, there's no reason to change because if we did, we both get 0 if we unilaterally changed. So if we're at the coffee house and we know we want to be at the pub because that's the social optimum, 2 + 2 is 4, highest payoff, how do we make that leap? Right? So we got the 2 Nash Equilibrium in this game. So how do we choose? Well, best guess. I think I know what you think, I think I know, and I'm guessing what you like, and you're guessing what I like, and I don't like to drink, and I don't like smelly bars, so you say, all right, we'll meet at the coffee house. I know that you like a beer and you don't mind bars, so I say, I'm thinking myself, we're going to meet at the pub. And so expectations about what the other person likes, that's your best guess, right? So and neither of those are a focal point, which is the next one. A focal point means that we both know that we like coffee. And I know you like coffee more than beer. I know you like coffee more than beer. I like coffee more than beer. Boom, the focal point's a coffee house. Or flip it on its head. I know you like beer more than coffee. I like beer more than coffee. Boom, the focal point is the pub. So that's another way to solve this. Another one is called risk dominance, where we both focus on picking the safest bet. In this case, the coffee house, right? That's just the safe bet. Let's just assume you don't like beer. So I'm assuming that. Payoff dominance would be where we both focus in on the payoff that's the highest for each of us, and that would be the pub. So what kind of person are you? Are you a person who's risk averse and want to play it safe? Or are you a person who's trying to maximize payoffs? Well, I'd have to know that about you in order to figure this out. So coordination games are incredibly interesting, even though they're very simple the way we've drawn them out here. But think about throwing 200 countries together and trying to come up with a strategy on tariffs and trade. Lots of different motivations, lots of different preferences, lots of different beliefs in the room. How are you going to coordinate on what is a feasible strategy? And so you're not stuck in a low equilibrium, low payoff equilibrium, but you're stuck in a higher payoff equilibrium. It's super interesting. Thomas Schelling was the economist who really laid this all out for policymakers, and he was also part of the Rand Corporation that came up with the strategy for mutually assured destruction when we were dealing with the former Soviet Union and the US and everybody had nuclear bombs. Well, everybody still does, but at the time we were worried about a first launch. Well, the whole idea being that, look, if you launch, we're going to launch and we are going to destroy each other. So the best equilibrium is not the launch, right? So you have two equilibria in that game. We both hit the red button and we're both wiped out, or neither of us hits the red button and neither of us are wiped out. And the focal point is existence and survival, so that people were able to not get into a nuclear war, even if we got close with the Cuban Missile Crisis. But that was the whole notion. So Thomas Schelling is an amazing economist, won the Nobel Prize years back, and he has got a book called The Strategy of Conflict. And so if you're interested in game theory, it's a great book. It's not an easy book, but it's written in 1960, and it still is one of the best books you're ever going to read on strategic thinking and how to think about playing a game against opponents. Boy, game theory at one point was all about writing books about how do you fight a duel with noisy and silent bullets. How do you fight a duel with more than one bullet in a game? It was all this strategy on essentially a Cold War strategy on dealing with the former Soviet Union, because we were stuck in a point where one equilibrium was truly not acceptable, mutually assured destruction, and the other equilibrium of peace, essentially peace with a big stick behind it, given nuclear bombs, was important. So here's another coordination game when it comes to dealing in business: shake or bow, or shake hands or bow. If you're dealing with business in different countries, what do you offer up your hand to shake, and they bow. Well, that's pretty awkward. I know I've been in that situation myself where my humor is not appreciated because uh, of language issues, if it's a very dry humor. So, how do I act in meetings with? This was a group from Japan that I was dealing with, and I was out of line by not being in tune with their definition of humor and my definition of humor, and it just got kind of clumsy and awkward. So learning other cultures and learning other social signals and social norms becomes incredibly important if you're trying to do business, and it becomes worse. All right, so let's take a look here at the example where we come back to trade now, and we'll focus in on the US versus China. So if we look at a tariff game between the US and China, we can see we've got two Nash Equilibria here, one bad at minus 50 for the total payoff, and one good at plus 150 when we don't have the tariff. Now you can solve this game following those 6 steps, and you should get those two as your Nash Equilibria. Again, if you have a problem with that, let me know, but you should be able to solve this game on your own now and end up with those two Nash Equilibria. And again, the question is, do we want to get into a tariff war? And most economists would argue no, because why is minus 50 better than plus 150, right? And so the argument that President Trump was making about let's just slap on tariffs, well, from most economists and game theorists' perspective, this is lose-lose rather than a win-win. And having no tariffs is the win-win. Now, you could broaden out this game to say, well, we're ignoring, it's much more complicated than this, and that would be fine. Draw it out. What is this game missing that doesn't capture this tariff? One argument you could say is human rights, right? If you got child labor, if you have slave labor, perhaps putting a tariff on is better because that minus 50 is the price you pay to get that other country to stop abusing human rights. And you say, well, we're willing to put these tariffs on and suffer this consequence because we have a bigger goal in mind than just trading and economics. We are really trying to elevate human rights. But that's a different game than I've drawn here. We need a bigger game that would include the other country actually making a change to get rid of child labor, to get rid of slave labor from prisoners, etc. We need to redraw this game into something bigger. So if we get stuck in this bad equilibrium, how do we jump to the good equilibrium? Policies, trade agreements, negotiations, job owning. I mean, a lot of times now, it's interesting to watch politicians. They'll bash China at one moment, then they'll sweet talk them the next moment, and the Chinese will do the same thing. And it's all involved in trying to move from this negative minus 50 up to this 150 without losing face. So again, there's so many human elements involved in game theory that these payoffs may or may not capture. And so part of the strategy here is to be able to say, well, what are these games capturing and what are they missing? And can these games help us understand general tariff games? Here's another game that helps sort of illustrate the unraveling of two countries. We can see here, it's called a Centipede game. So there's two players, player I and player 2, or 1 and 2 again. And what happens is if player 1 agrees to continue, you can see the payoff goes from a total of 4 plus 1, 5, to a total of 10, 2 plus 8. So the pie is getting bigger as both of us agree to continue. And if we agree to continue all the way to the end, player 2 would agree to continue, and the payoff now is 320, which is much bigger than 5 where we started. But in the Centipede game, we can see the temptation is to unravel. All right. So if we look at what the Nash Equilibrium of this game is, let's start at the very end and work backwards. That's called backward induction. So if we take a look at this, player 2, if they continue, they're going to get 64. But if they stop, they're going to get 128. All right, so the end game, the last move, is for player 2 to stop, and they get 128 as opposed to 64. That's the temptation for them to end the game at the very last play instead of continuing onward, just to stop it. Well, if player 1 knows that, player 1 can evaluate 64 versus 32. And so they're going to stop in round 5 because 64 is greater than 32. So we're never going to end up to the end game. But if player 2 knows that, then they're going to stop in round 4 because 32 is greater than 16. But if player 1 knows that, they're going to stop in round 3 because 16 is greater than 8. But if player 2 knows that, they're going to stop in round 2 because 8 is greater than 4. But if player 1 knows that, they're going to stop right at the beginning because 4 is greater than 2. Right? So this Centipede game, the Nash Equilibrium, is for the first player to stop immediately. And the payoff is 4 for them and 1 for player 2, which is considerably lower than 320 if they had continued all the way through. But if I don't trust you're going to keep passing the game along and you're going to end it at the very last play, the thing unravels. And so we're not going to cooperate at all, right? This is what is a prisoner's dilemma or a race to the bottom, in which the equilibrium is never to cooperate. It's just to end the game immediately. And so you have a big difference between the social optimum and the Nash equilibrium in this game. And this game captures a lot of relationships where it never gets off the ground because I don't trust you to play fair at the end. I'm never even going to get in this game with you. I'm just opting out immediately and doing something else. We're never going to be trade partners because I think at some point you're going to stop the game and leave me hanging in the lurch. Right? So why trade collapses without trust? And we end up with the Nash Equilibria way back at the beginning, quite a bit different than the social optimum. Okay, so framing globalization as a game is a good way to think about it if you believe that globalization and trade and economic coordination is a strategic game. Game theory can help us understand what happens if people are playing rationally. If you have credible threats, we can understand why free trade can fail if we fail to coordinate our actions. We can see how trade wars or tariff threats reduces economic efficiency, because if we start eroding trust, we start coming out to the equilibrium that has the worst payoff, not the best payoff. And that if we're going to coordinate, it's going to require a focal point that all the countries can rally behind to get the greatest economic efficiency. So if the goal is the biggest economic pie, then free trade is the way to go. But if there's some other goal like world dominance or some macho display of power, that's not necessarily in this game and the way I've designed it as an economist. And Therefore, we're going to end up with reduced economic efficiency, even though the players might be maximizing some other objective, which is, take over the world, or uh, in thinking about their country first, as opposed to thinking about, the world as one big planet we all live on. So, game theory is a great way to organize your thinking about this type of strategy, and you can apply it globally around the world: Bangladesh, India, China, India, all through Latin America. How do we coordinate policies there? Central America, Europe. There's no end to how game theory can be used, both on a very large scale, planet wise, and even in your own life, as thinking about what do you expect from the other player to do when your payoffs are interlinked. All right, send me any questions you got about game theory, please.